What happened at the Nile River? A ray of early morning sunlight stole into the little hut and gently fell onto Jara's face, slowly awakening her. Wearily, she opened her eyes and looked around the dim room. No one else was awake. She could feel Tirza stirring beside her and heard her little sister moan in her sleep. "Oh, what I wouldn't give for a day to just rest," she thought with a small groan. Her muscles ached from yesterday's work. Outside the door, Jara could see her mother cooking something in the fire pit. The smell made Jara hungry. She knew that there was no use in trying to go back to sleep. Stretching and yawning, she rose from the bed and stepped outside. The harsh sun against the white sand dunes in the distance stung her eyes. In front of Jara, the nearby marshlands and the distant desert stretched out in all directions. A twisted band of silver wound its way through the sand and grass and fields, the Nile River. To her left was the crowded Hebrew town filled with similar mud and brick buildings. On Jara's right was the tall, magnificent city of Ramesses. Jara shielded her face with her calloused hand and tried to focus on her mother, who was kneading bread dough next to the fire. "Do you need any help, Mother?" Jara asked. Her mother's face looked pained. "Oh, there you are," her mother said, straightening her back. "I thought you were going to sleep the whole morning. Go wake the others. We don't have much time until Amasai comes, and we still need to get water from the creek and eat something." "Yes, Mother," Jara responded, trying not to imitate Mother's exasperated tone. When Jara stepped inside to wake the others, she realized that Eaton and Father were gone. Must have gone to the Nile to pray, she thought. Once everyone was up, Jara started to set out the clay bowls for their breakfast while Lemuel, Tirza, and Raphael went to a fork of the Nile River. They brought clothes to wash and pitchers to carry back water for the day. As they left, Shayna came in from taking Yanni on this morning's walk. Shayna took Yanni for a walk every morning as an excuse to waste his energy, but Jara knew that Shayna also went to see some of her own friends. Shayna spent any spare time she had with 3 boys named Meir, Yafet, and Zafan. Jara was disgusted by those 3 boys. They were lazy good-for-nothings, always looking for trouble, and very flirtatious. Jara couldn't stand flirtatious people, and she couldn't stand doing Shayna's work for her while she was out having fun. Why couldn't Shayna pick one of the nice boys who spent time with the elders like Eaton did? If Shayna had to spend all of her time with boys, why not pick one that was actually ready to get married? Jara wished Shayna was more like Ada. "There you are," Shayna said to Jara in an irate fashion. "I was afraid you were still going to be asleep. Did you ask Mother if she needed any help?" "Yes, I did. Why wouldn't I?" Jara mumbled sarcastically. Why did her sister always have to boss her around? Suddenly Jara noticed the tone in her voice and whispered, "I'm sorry, Shayna. I shouldn't have responded like that." "Well, hurry up," Shayna ordered, obviously not even considering making an apology of her own. "Amasai will be here in just a few minutes and we'll have to get to work, with or without food." Her sister's tone hadn't changed, but Jara was able to suffocate the harsh feelings that were now rising in her chest as she turned back to finish putting out the wooden utensils. In a few minutes, Lemuel, Tirza, and Raphael came back to the hut with the wet clothes and drinking water. Tirza was also helping Mother carry in a pot of porridge. Everyone took their places at the table as their mother looked outside worriedly. "Everyone start eating. I don't know where your father and brother are, but we don't have time to waste. They'll just have to miss breakfast," Mother instructed. To herself, she muttered resentfully, "And after everything I said to him last night, too." Lemuel took the initiative to pray to Yahweh in very intimate tones and thanked him for the food. They had just started eating when their father and Eaton returned hurriedly. "At last," said Mother in a scolding tone. "You're late again, and Amasai will be here any minute to give us our tasks for the day." "I'm sorry, Muriel. We were praying, and the time passed so quickly." Father shared a knowing smile with Eaton and then greeted the rest of his children. Eaton also said "good morning" to his siblings and then sat down and devoured the hunk of bread and porridge set before him. In Eaton's eyes, there shone that light of peace and love that always came from his talks with Father. "After everything I said to you last night, encouraging you to be home more and to let me have time with Eaton, you still persist in being late," Mother grumbled. Father stopped eating long enough to reply with some annoyance. "We were also discussing what to do to help you around the house, Muriel." "Oh." Mother seemed slightly taken aback, but she caught herself quickly and stated, "I'm glad you're actually thinking of me." They had barely finished eating when Amasai, the Israelite foreman, strode into the house. He had a scowl on his tan face. "I'm afraid you won't have time to clean up from breakfast," he began. "Our workload has been doubled. We need to get moving." Everyone gasped. "Doubled?" Mother exploded. Why? For what reason? Amasai sighed and shook his head. Last night there was a huge uproar in the palace. I'm sure since you all are so involved with deliveries to the palace that you've heard rumors and stories about the lost prince. Jara nodded. She had heard many people mention the lost prince named Moses. Everyone thought that he was dead. She'd been told that Moses was an Israelite who had been adopted into the palace as a young child, and that when he was 40 years old, he killed an Egyptian who was beating a helpless Hebrew man. He had then fled into the desert. No one had heard from him since. What about the lost prince? Father asked. He's come back, Amasai exclaimed. He's now an old man, nearly 80 years of age. He's come back demanding the Israelites' freedom, saying that Yahweh met him in the Midian desert and commanded him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. What does that have to do with us working twice as hard as we do now? Mother interrupted. The Pharaoh was infuriated by Moses' request for freedom. He was so mad that he immediately said, we have to collect our own straw to make bricks. The Egyptians are not going to supply us with straw anymore. Not only that, but we still have to produce the same amount of bricks, or more bricks, than we did before. The Pharaoh was obviously in a rage. I'm surprised he didn't order Moses to be executed right then and there. Moses should have known no good would have come out of a confrontation with Pharaoh, Mother snapped. What right does he have to come back here and get us all into trouble? Amasai shrugged, still scowling. None of the elders are pleased. He's supposed to come and meet with us today along with his brother Aaron. It seems that Yahweh has given them some form of divine power. But enough about that. We must get to work. Today, all our group is scouring the land for straw. Our 10 families alone need to bring in 100 bushels of straw. Hopefully that will last us until next week. Amasai exhaled slowly. 100 bushels? Father said in shock. Yes, I know, but that's how many we need to supply us all week. Everyone needs to be out working today, including the young boys. Marielle, you are excused to continue weaving cloth. Eaton, you are going to be at the mixing pits. The rest of you, hurry up and find all the straw you can. A stunned silence rested on the family as Amasai hurried on to the next hut. Everyone feverishly ran around gathering water and food for the day. Then they all ran to the marshlands, sickles in hand, ready to cut the thick grass and wild wheat that grew there. Jara, Tirza, and Shayna worked as a team, but gathering 60 pounds of straw to make a full bushel was no easy task. Once they packed the straw together into tight bundles, they tied them together with strips of cloth. Jara hoisted the bushel to her back, and stooping over with the weight, she walked as fast as she could towards the marketplace where the straw was to be delivered. It was more than a mile walk just to get there. Jara's feet beat out a sad rhythm on the dirt street. Many other children and adults walked along next to her. Almost no one spoke. The weight they were carrying, and the weight of knowing what would happen to them at the end of the day if they didn't work their hardest, pushed them onwards in a type of frenzied despair. Jara lowered her head against the sun's blinding rays, focusing on the ground in front of her. Her eyes misted with tears. She didn't want to go on. She didn't think she could go on, but she knew she had no choice. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Jara pushed herself to go faster. It was still early morning. Maybe, just maybe, they could finish their work in time. 8, Jara grunted, strapping another bushel to her back. Her feet were sore. Her shoulders were throbbing. Hurry, Sheena panted. Her hands were bleeding and she was drenched in sweat and covered in dirt. There's only 1 hour till sundown. Keep working. Jara nodded and turned once again onto the road. Only 1 more hour. In a way, it was a relief to know that work was almost over. But did they have enough straw? Had the other families done their job? Jara knew she probably only had time for 1 more bushel at best. I can do this. I can do this, she kept telling herself. She urged herself to go even faster. Every movement she made seemed to drain more energy from her body, but she couldn't stop. Tears of absolute exhaustion clouded Jara's vision. Her foot hit a stone. Jara's ankle twisted and she fell to the ground with a low cry. Jara could no longer keep her tears back. She sobbed in pain and anguish. Jara! Jara looked up and through her tears saw her best friend Amisa running towards her with a bushel of straw tied to her back. A voice next to her said, Here, let's help you up. It was Amisa's 14-year-old brother, Ezra. Ezra and Amisa pulled Jara to her feet. Thank you, Jara murmured, choking back her sobs. Amisa grabbed her hand and squeezed it. She looked so pale and tired. Come on, let's walk together. Jara could only nod back. The 3 friends walked quickly towards the market. Jara was limping a little. Her foot felt like it was swelling, but being in the presence of her friends helped her and encouraged her to keep going. Everyone was too tired to say anything, but every time Jara slipped or moaned a little, Amisa squeezed her hand and Ezra gave her his signature teasing grin. Even his dark eyes seemed to be smiling. How can he be so happy? Jara asked herself. He looks just as tired and worn out as me and Amisa. Jara, did you go to the palace last night? Amisa questioned, finally breaking the silence. Yes, Jara muttered, shifting the weight on her back. I saw Ada. Your sister told me. Tell them I'm fine and that I'm seeing Yahweh at work in Egypt at last. They, and you, will see what I mean soon enough. She must have been in the throne room when Moses was there, Ezra mused. Well, if Yahweh caused all this extra work, I don't know if I want anything to do with him, Amisa grumbled angrily, kicking at some straw on the road. Ezra turned his dark eyes to his sister and glared at her. Amisa, I know you don't mean that. This isn't Yahweh's fault. It's the Pharaoh's. Besides, maybe Adah's referring to something else. Amisa looked down at her toes, looking sad and forlorn. No, I guess I really didn't mean that. I'm sorry. Jara shook her head and grimaced as she put weight on her swollen foot. Amisa may be sorry for what she said, but I think the same thing. If Yahweh caused this, I don't know if I want to have anything to do with him or Moses. Jara felt anger rising up in her chest. How could Moses do this to us? She wailed inwardly. She didn't know how she was supposed to make it through this day, let alone tomorrow. Someone, anyone, please, she cried. Please deliver us. Jara, a voice hissed. Huh? What? Jara slowly rolled over and forced her eyes to open. Everything was blurry. Her eyelids were heavy. She felt so tired, and she heard all over. Get up. It was her mother shaking her arm. It's breakfast time. Jara groaned and made herself get up. She staggered around the hut doing chores in a daze. She felt stupid and dumb with exhaustion. Her ankle was still sore. For 2 days their workload had been doubled. The hard work that they had all had to do, particularly the men, had left its mark on all of the Israelites, and still they hadn't met their daily quota of bricks for the last 2 days. The other members of the family came in from doing chores and prayed one by one. This morning they didn't all eat together. They just rushed through the meal and started to clean up. Jara was bent over the washbowl when a shadow darkened the doorway. She spun around to see Amasai leaning heavily against the doorpost. Jara almost screamed. His back was covered with blood. He had been whipped. Amasai! Father and Eaton both leapt to their feet and ran to Amasai. They supported him, one on either side, and helped him sit down on a chair. Amasai let out a weak sigh and gratefully drank the water that Father offered him. I'll be all right in a moment, he said breathily. I just can't walk much. But the pain will wear off soon, and I must go on. Amasai groaned and gingerly moved to a different position. What happened? Father questioned. Amasai slowly shook his head. We didn't make the amount of bricks we need to yesterday or the day before. Almost all of the foremen didn't get their people to complete the extra work. It's just too much, but Pharaoh won't listen. He ordered most of us to be whipped last night and sent us home in the dark in our disgrace. He didn't even send anyone with us to help us back to our dwellings. And that's when we saw that troublemaker, Moses. Amasai spat out the name. He apologized for all that has happened to us, but said that Yahweh still wants him here. Almost all of the elders and foremen wished the demon was back in the accursed desert. There was a moment of silence as Amasai finished his water and then rose to his feet. Everyone must work hard today. If we don't make our quota, not only will I be whipped again, but some of you might be whipped too. He looked right in Jara's eyes. He looked angry, but also very worried. Jara's heart was pounding. She felt as if a huge weight was resting on her shoulders. If I don't work my hardest, everyone will be punished. It'll be all my fault, Jara gulped. Asher and Eaton, the Pharaoh has ordered a new temple to be erected on the other side of the Nile. Go down to the dock. There will be boats to help you and the other Israelites get across. Lemuel, you'll be gathering clay for bricks, as usual. Shayna will need help down at the sand pit repairing and making baskets and carrying sand. Jara and Tirzah, you'll be beating out the papyrus to make scrolls again. We'll have to go to a different part of the Nile, though. We exhausted the supply of reeds in this part of Goshen. If you two will, go join Ezra and Amisa. I'll be back in a couple of moments to bring you up to Ramesses. Be quick, all of you. And if anyone finishes their work early, go get some more straw. I'm afraid we're going to run out before next week. With a weary sigh, Amasai walked slowly and carefully out of the house. Jara and Tirzah quickly washed up and drank some water. They were the first ones outside. They ran over to Amisa's house next door. Amisa was already outside, waiting. She looked tired and white with dark circles under her blue eyes. Where's Ezra? Jara questioned. He'll be right here. He had to feed the animals, Amisa said quietly. She appeared to be thinking about something. What's the matter? Jara prodded. Oh, I was just thinking about what Father said. He just came back from a meeting with the elders. I was just thinking about the amazing sign Aaron and Moses performed before the Pharaoh last night. What amazing sign? Jara asked. You didn't hear about that? Amisa's eyes widened. To show Yahweh's power, Aaron turned his staff into a snake. The magicians turned their sticks into snakes too, but it sounds like they used a fake magic. Anyways, Aaron's snake ate up the magician's snakes, but the Pharaoh was mad and sent Moses away. That's amazing. A miracle, Jara gasped. But she stopped and bit her lip. But what? Amisa pressed. I'm not doubting that they had Yahweh's power, but what good did it do? Work is still just as hard. Pharaoh's still making us get our own straw. Why did Yahweh make our work harder? Jara was trying hard to not be angry, but it wasn't working. She could tell that her face was flushed and her chest felt constricted, almost like she wanted to scream and yell. The weight of the responsibility on her shoulders and her wrath at Moses made her feel depressed and irritated. Amisa looked down at her toes. I don't know, she whispered softly. I was just thinking the same thing. Amasai came up to them, panting and grimacing with pain. He was taking slow, agonizing steps. Sorry to keep you girls waiting. I had to give out the extra orders. Where's Ezra? We need to go. I'm here. Ezra dashed out from behind the house, breathing hard, his golden brown hair blowing in the wind. Sorry, he said, coming up to Amasai. I'm ready. Let's go. Amasai started off down the dusty street, moving as quickly as his wounds would allow him to go. Jara kept her eyes down on the ground, trying not to look at Amasai's bloody back. She tried to think about where they would be working and getting her job done as fast as possible. Ezra came up next to her. You ready to work hard? He asked, sending her his signature teasing grin. But Jara didn't feel like smiling back. How can you be happy? She asked, almost accusingly. We still have twice the amount of work to do. What's there to be happy about? It was all she could do to control her temper and keep from yelling at Ezra. She knew it wasn't his fault, but right now she didn't feel like acting happy. Well, if I wasn't happy, I'd be angry like you, Ezra teased. Jara had to smile a little at that. Besides, we don't have to make or move bricks. Our work won't be too much harder, just longer, and you can't help but be a little excited that someone stood up to Pharaoh and didn't get killed for it. Yahweh's with Moses and with Aaron. Something good is going to come of this. How can you be so sure? Jara felt more like moping than celebrating. Ezra shrugged. I don't know. I just think Yahweh's going to do something big for us. He said someday we'd go to the promised land, and this is the first leader he's ever brought to us. Now let's hurry and catch up to Amasai. Amasai led them to a section of the Nile that was south of the city of Ramesses, but pretty close to the palace. Jara could see the Egyptian soldiers standing guard on top of a sand dune several hundred yards away. Get to work, Amasai urged. Just stay around here. We don't want to get too close to the palace. Those guards will report us for sure. Amasai went over to an Egyptian overseer who stood several yards away on the bank of the Nile, watching the Israelites who were already at work. Ezra darted off to join the other men and boys who were pulling reeds from the water. Jara, Amisa, and Tirzah joined a group of young women and girls who were laying out the papyrus reeds and beating them with mallets. Everyone worked quickly and quietly. They weren't allowed to talk much. The overseers thought that talk slowed them down. Jara remembered a time when she was beaten for talking. She would never forget the nauseating pain of the whip's blows. While they worked, the heat increased, and it soon became unbearable. Jara's back felt like it was on fire. At least I get to sit down, she thought, though I wish there was some shade. Jara looked at the men who were pulling reeds. She felt so sorry for them. She could tell from the stains on the sand that some of their feet were beginning to bleed from stepping on the sharp reeds. Jara quickly looked back at her work. The three girls worked diligently and didn't stop to even wipe their hair from their faces, for the overseer working on this part of the Nile was watching them with eagle eyes. Jara often felt the overseer's glare resting on her. It made her very nervous. He was looking at her with evil intent in his eyes. Hardly daring to move her eyes from the wooden mallet in her hand, Jara worked so hard that her arms ached and trembled from the exertion. She was practically holding her breath, trying to work hard to gain the man's favor and not get whipped. Finally, the overseer moved on to another group of workers, picking up the papyrus reeds. Jara shuddered and wished desperately that Ezra was around. Not only was he fun to work with, but she would have loved his protective presence right about now. From the way the overseer was acting, she was worried that he was going to beat her. She saw Ezra in the distance, dropping another bundle of reeds into the ever-growing pile by the street. The overseer was just beginning to beat an old man with the whip. Jara hated the sound of the blood-curdling yells and the crack of the whip, and from the dark look on Ezra's face she could tell that he hated them too. But Amisa frantically mouthed to Ezra, "Don't try anything. and Ezra slowly walked away, looking like he would have rather started a fight with the Egyptian for his unjustness instead of going back to work. No matter how hard Jara tried to focus on her work, she kept thinking about Moses' plea and the Pharaoh's injustice. She wondered if Ezra was right about Moses being their deliverer, but she couldn't entertain that thought for long. Every time she thought about Moses, she got a little angrier. She couldn't help but be upset that he was the cause of more work. Suddenly she heard laughter. Jara looked up. In the distance she saw a covered, richly painted flat boat being poled along through the water. From the ornate wigs and the glint of gold, Jara knew that a royal party was enjoying a morning ride on the Nile River. She saw what looked like a throne on the boat, and Jara realized that the Pharaoh was probably on board. It looked like they were having so much fun. Jara envied their life of ease and began to feel even worse about the hardship she was enduring. "It's just not fair," she fumed. "We're people too. We deserve a rest. We deserve to live like they live." A shout interrupted her thoughts. "It's Moses!" Jara brushed the damp hair away from her forehead and looked down the dirt road. 2 men were coming their way. Through the haze of sand and heat, they came closer and closer. Jara squinted her eyes and stared. The man on the right was the shorter and stouter of the two, with a gray beard and a long walking stick. She recognized him as Aaron, one of the leading Levites in Goshen. To the left, however, was quite a different man. He was tall, broad, and looked surprisingly strong for being an elderly man. He held a long staff and walked with determination and fearlessness. He carried himself like royalty. Jara instantly knew who he was. He was Moses. Jara felt anger seething inside of her. Here was the man who was causing all their extra trouble. What was he doing here? Was he coming to gloat over their weakness? He better not come near me, Jara thought, clamping her jaw shut to keep from yelling at him. I don't want anything to do with him. He needs to go back to the desert where he belongs. Aaron and Moses were moving away from them now, and up and over the sand dune and towards the Nile River. They were heading toward the Pharaoh's boat. Jara drew in her breath. She saw the soldiers who were guarding the palace in the distance exchange looks and appear a little uneasy. They must be very brave or very dumb. No one approaches Pharaoh without his permission on pain of death. Jara saw Aaron raise his staff. She faintly heard him yelling in a clear voice, "Pharaoh, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, 'Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness.' Now behold, you have not listened to the voice of the Lord, but have hardened your heart. Thus says the Lord, by this you will know that I am the Lord. See, I will strike the water that is in the Nile with my staff, and it shall become blood, and all the fish that are in the Nile will die, and the water will smell foul, and the Egyptians will have a hard time finding any water that is not turned to blood." Everyone who was working around Jara was frozen as they watched the 2 men in the boat that was drawing near to them. Jara barely made out the form of Pharaoh standing at the side of the boat in open-mouthed rage and astonishment. Jara heard him shout, "Seize them!" The Egyptians who were pulling the boat instantly altered their course for the shore. Pharaoh's bodyguards on board the float drew their swords. Jara turned to look at Moses and Aaron. She expected them to run for their lives, but the men just stood there. Jara's jaw dropped open. They're going to get killed. They're being openly defiant. They're being really brave, but still, this is only going to bring more trouble to us and to them. Aaron now took a step forward. He raised his staff in the air and stretched it out over the Nile River. Unexpectedly, the surface of the water grew darker and darker and even darker until the muddy water of the Nile turned into a bright red. The Israelites jumped back from the river in horror, screaming. A wave of bright red water lapped up the bank, almost touching Jara's feet. She shrieked and scrambled up the bank. Tears grabbed her and clung to her arm. "What is it?" she cried. Jara turned to look at Aaron and Moses. Aaron was putting his staff down and nodding at Moses. Jara heard high-pitched cries and saw that the royal party on the boat was panicking, running around and screaming. The boat was pitching to and fro, and one of the men working the poles fell into the water. He surfaced, yelling and shouting about blood. "The water is blood?" Tirza screamed. Jara shook her head. She was stunned and amazed. The water had actually turned into blood. The panic on the riverbank and the boat slowly died down. The shock and wonder of what had just happened ended in a silent awe that spread rapidly over the people on the river. Everyone's eyes fixed on the Pharaoh, who stood at the end of the float, staring in bewilderment at the water. His eyes fixed on Moses and Aaron, still standing fearlessly on the bank, surveying the scene. The Pharaoh finally gestured to his bargemen. "Go back to the palace. Now, go summon my magicians." The men pulling the boat instantly obeyed. The Pharaoh looked over his shoulder and shouted, "You shall see, Moses. Our gods are greater than yours. You shall see whose is better by the time this is over." The Pharaoh sounded confident, but Jara thought that she heard a waver in his voice. Jara looked at Moses and Aaron. Even though they were far away, Jara saw that they looked very sad. Moses and Aaron turned towards the town and continued their walk. Jara's eyes followed them. She was still amazed by what had happened. There was a great hubbub among the Egyptians on the shore, and most of the overseers fled from the scene. One of the overseers turned to them and called out, "You're free to go home," and then ran from the vicinity of the Nile after his fellow comrades. The Israelites were still frozen in wonder. Slowly the crowd began to dissolve and moved in a mass back to their homes. Jara, Amisa, and Tirzah still stood on the riverbanks, gazing off into the distance. "That was amazing," Amisa murmured. "How did he do it, Jara?" Tirzah breathed in awe. Jara just shrugged. She felt dazed. All she knew was that the most wonderful miracle had been performed here today. She had never ever heard of such a display of power, not even from the magicians. Ezra came running up to them. "That was incredible, incredible," he exclaimed. "Amisa, we've got to go back and tell them. Yahweh's working through Moses, just like Father said." Ezra was beaming with delight and excitement as he grabbed his sister's hand. "Come on, let's go." Everyone ran back to their homes. Jara's mind was whirling. Moses has Yahweh's power. I saw it. Maybe, just maybe, we'll be free.